Sup folks, ExoParadigmGamer here. We're finally back for another Conkerific episode of Remake or Rebreak because it's been a long time. It's been since Super Mario 64, and I know a lot of you guys have been looking forward to another episode in this segment, so here we are. In case you guys didn't see my regular review of Super Mario Sunshine, at the end I announced I wanted to do like a marathon where I look at remakes that are kind of more mediocre to poor. And I still want to do that because I think it's important to, kind of look at the bad stuff so you can get a better appreciation for the good stuff. And most of the stuff I look at is kind of the good stuff, so I think it's an important marathon. But right now, I'm really interested in doing something on N64 because, truth be told, I spent a lot of time and money RGB modding this son of a bitch so I could get better footage, and yeah, I want to put it to good use. So, what better game to test out the N64's graphical prowess than Conker's Bad Fur Day on the Nintendo 64? And while we're looking at that, we might as well look at Conker Live and Reloaded on the Microsoft Xbox. Now, this is a remake that not a lot of people seem to like. Because when I think of remakes that people hate, this is one that comes to mind usually. And as always, I want to look at that. I want to look at the game in depth to see if that's warranted. And honestly, I think that's going to be a little bit more interesting than what I had planned for the first Remake Rebreak episode coming back and, that new marathon. Either way, you guys get a new ROR episode, so I figured you'd be cool with it. So, yeah, let's hop to it.
Conker the Squirrel, who's named after the horse Chestnut by the way, made his first appearance in 1997's Diddy Kong Racing on the N64 as part of the playable roster. Developer and gaming legend Rare Limited soon after announced that Conker would go on to star in his own N64 adventure. Conker's Quest, later known as 12 Tales Conker 64, was slated to be a 3D platforming game in the vein of Super Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie. When critics previewed the early builds of the game, however, the game was supposedly criticized for being more of the same kiddie fare that characterized Rare's gaming lineup at the time. Series creator, artist, and producer Chris Seaver then approached Rare co-founder Chris Stamper and pitched the idea of completely redesigning the game to target a mature audience. Stamper, surprisingly, gave the green light, and Conker 64 underwent a complete design overhaul. Meanwhile, Conker would make his solo debut in 1999 in Conker's Pocket Tales for the Game Boy Color, which seems to have a mixed reputation as far as I can gather. The retooled Conker game was eventually revealed as Conker's Bad Fur Day, which later hit Western store shelves in spring of 2001. With critics and consumers alike lauding the game for its technical excellence and unique comedic stylings, Conker's Bad Fur Day went on to become a cult classic for the Nintendo 64, though only scoring comparatively mediocre sales. That said, the game still sold about 1 million copies, so I'm not sure why it has to cost $70 to get a cart now. Perceiver was supposedly ready to begin work on a direct sequel, Conker's Other Bad Fur Day, which would have picked up soon after the events of the first game. The story was all written up and the game was ready to enter production, but I'm sure you all know what happened next. In 2002, Rare changed ownership from Nintendo to Microsoft, who had recently entered the console market with the original Xbox. The story behind this is complicated and I'd prefer not to spend too much time on it. Suffice it to say that Microsoft and Rare had some creative differences right out of the gate, and Conker's Other Bad Fur Day was eventually retooled into a full remake of the N64 original with an emphasis on online multiplayer through Xbox Live. Although this remake was well received by critics, it has received a lot of criticism from members of the Conker fanbase for deviations from the original. For the sake of review, I'd like to address the whole Microsoft ruined Rare thing right up front. Now again, the facts are complicated and ambiguous as to who exactly is responsible for Rare's fall from grace, be that many of its star employees leaving around the time of the buyout or interference from Microsoft itself. I'm not really here to debate the specifics because that doesn't really matter to the topic at hand. More to the point, I would personally agree that such a fall from grace did occur, despite a few decent to good games coming out since 2002. When you look at what's going on nowadays with Banjo-Kazooie and Conker and everything else, it's clear that Rare and Microsoft have no idea what to do with them. And I'm equally annoyed that Microsoft seems content to sit on all these great properties rather than do anything constructive with them, Rare Replay aside. Frankly, I would have preferred a direct sequel to Conker's Bad Fur Day over a remake just as much as anyone else. That said, my feelings on Microsoft or the once possibility of a direct sequel are irrelevant as to whether Conker Live and Reloaded itself is a good remake or not. Remake or Rebreak is a segment where I examine the classics of the past and compare them with subsequent significant re-releases to see whether they hold up today, with a special emphasis on whether and how well these re-releases improve upon the original experience.
So, as always, I'm committed to giving both versions of this title an honest and thorough review, because that's just what I do. And what that means is I'm gonna have to put aside any bias I may have against Microsoft for their treatment of Rare or anything else, and examine the remake on its own merits. Without further ado, this is Conker's Bad Fur Day, Remake or Rebreak.
Before I go any further, I want to make it clear that I will be spoiling this game rotten. Usually I'm not as concerned about this, but your experience with Conker's Bad Fur Day will benefit immensely from a totally blind playthrough. If you have any interest whatsoever in playing this game for yourself and haven't already, I say go for it. Without saying too much, both versions of the game are suitable ways to experience this title. And if you own an Xbox One, then Rare Replay is an alright option for playing the N64 version. That said, I do opine that there is a preferable version out of the bunch, and the answer may surprise you. If you're antsy to know which, but don't want to bother with spoilers, then skip ahead to this timestamp to find out. Chances are, however, you've played this game already, in which case I'd obviously recommend watching the video in full. Another thing I'd like to mention is that all the footage you're watching was captured from authentic Nintendo 64 and Xbox hardware over RGB SCART and YPV-PR component, respectively. These high-quality analog signals are then processed using the XRGB Mini FrameMeister. Yes, I did spend a hefty sum on all of this, but it's well worth it to get YouTube-worthy footage straight from the original hardware. That said, let's begin with the story. One night, while partying with some conscripts at the local pub, Conker the Squirrel has a little too much to drink and gets himself lost while trying to find his way home. Waking up in a strange land, Conker now vies to find a way out and reunite with his girlfriend Barry. Along the way, he crosses paths with a menagerie of strange creatures and gets himself into an assortment of outlandish situations. On paper, the story for Conker's Bad Fur Day is very similar to that of Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. The plot in both cases, which see Alice and Conker respectively trying to find their way home, is essentially an excuse to float from one scene to the next in which a relatable everyman is juxtaposed against a comedic foil. Both characters also cross paths with a hot-tempered tyrant who seeks to capture and mutilate them for their own selfish purposes. In the end, both characters find a greater appreciation for what they had and the banality of everyday life. Of course, Conker obviously differs in its decisively adult tone and content. Honestly, Chris Seaver and Robin Beanland deserve an award or something because the writing in this game is absolutely incredible. It's almost like the comedy was tailor-made just for me. Granted, I'll laugh at the dumbest shit.
I buy all my groceries from Stink Mart. I like how that's something that Michael thinks is funny. Like, really funny.
In this case, literally, but if this kind of humor gels with you, then I think you're really gonna enjoy these cutscenes. If you like scatological humor, then I've got great news for you. Conker is full of blatant, lowbrow, poop and fart jokes, and I absolutely love them. Of course, the toilet humor is only the tip of the cockamedic shiteberg. Conker runs the gamut of oblique movie references, innuendos, fourth wall breaking, and meta humor.
Okay, I'll just cross this threshold here. I'm sure if that's of some significance. I don't think what it is. Anyway, my fair do.
What?
Nothing.
Honestly, my favorite comedic moments in this game are just too many to list. I love the twist at the end of the Bats Tower chapter. I love all the shit particles flying around. I love how you kill these 3 wasps only for them to suddenly show up alive later in the game and then die again in the same fashion. It's dumb as hell and I love it. Beyond the humor, however, Conker's Bad Fur Day is really violent. Several characters get blown up into a million gory pieces. Others get ground up into a bloodied pulp. Still more are brutally devoured by dinosaurs. The list goes on. Come to think of it, there's a lot of moments in the game where you flat out murder people, like this cute baby dinosaur that thinks you're its mommy. It really gets you thinking about how murderous platforming mascots are when you stop and think about it. Actually, if it wasn't for the cartoon blood, then Conker wouldn't be too out of the ordinary. On top of all that, Conker's Bad Fur Day is a wonderful tribute / parody of the cutesy platforming genre, as well as a snapshot of gaming in the late 90s. Much like everything in Banjo-Kazooie, normally inanimate objects have cartoon eyes and hop around. Relatedly, the main collectible in the game is wads of hopping cash, which yell at you to pick them up.
Put the money over here!
You get these whenever you complete major set pieces in the game, and Conker's materialism highlights how pointless collecting MacGuffins is when you really stop and think about it. The game also pokes fun at every genre from horror to racing to first-person shooters and contains all the familiar level cliches from the Banjo-Kazooie games. You might say it's Rare's way of laughing at itself. Part of what makes everything work so well is the presentation. Conker's Bad Fur Day is among the most technically advanced games on the system. The cartridge stores 64 megabytes of data, making Conker one of the largest games in the N64 library. Like most of Rare's classics, Conker brandishes a cartoony aesthetic that hasn't aged a day. The texture work takes advantage of the N64's characteristic brand of bilinear filtering to create some convincingly depth-filled textures that hold up surprisingly well even when the game is up-res to HD. The character models and level geometry are also leaps and bounds ahead of most N64 titles. The animations are also quite decent, though maybe a little awkward at times. Conker is also fully voice acted, which is unique for an N64 game, and it's surprisingly well done for what it is. Almost all the voice work comes from Chris Seaver himself, and while you can tell that it's just the one guy doing it all, you also get a pretty consistent performance that goes a long way in selling the comedy. At any rate, Chris Seaver does a better job than actors in a vast majority of games at the time. Even 2002's Star Fox Adventures, which Rare also produced.
Edo Su Tavuk, General Scales! Yeah!
Hey, Fox! Isn't this music getting on your nerves?
By the same token, the soundtrack is also quite impressive for an N64 title. Rare aficionados should be well acquainted with composer Robin Beanland, who also co-wrote the story with Chris Seaver. He's composed for titles like Donkey Kong Country, the Killer Instinct games, Conker's Pocket Tales, and also Rare's upcoming title, Sea of Thieves. Out of all the games he's worked on, however, Conker's Bad Fur Day might just be his magnum opus. And I'm not just talking about the Ballad of Chucky Poo. Much of the soundtrack has kind of a swing vibe to it, reminiscent of the sound direction found in mid-20th century cartoons like Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry. This sound direction complements the gratuitous cartoon violence excellently, with the game's main theme, Windy, being one of the standout overworld themes in video game history. Beyond swing, however, Beanland's score also contains its share of techno, rock and roll, Latin, ambient noise, movie soundtrack parodies, and even opera. Yes, opera. Also impressive is that many cutscenes also have unique scores accompanying them, which is especially noticeable when a character is getting blown to pieces. Bottom line, it's great stuff and one of the highlights of Conker's Bad Fur Day for sure. My only gripe with the presentation is that, like with many N64 classics, Conker is prone to noticeable frame drops. There are times where I swear the frame rate drops to 20 FPS and just chugs. I'd be lying if I said it adversely affected the gameplay, but it certainly doesn't help in some situations, and it just makes the game feel more dated than it would be otherwise. So I'll bet you're wondering how the Xbox version stacks up in terms of presentation. Overall, I'd say it's a nice improvement, subject to a few caveats. First off, the graphics have obviously been remade from the ground up, and it's a monumental improvement over the original on the whole. In fact, if it wasn't for the standard definition video output, Conker Live and Reloaded could pass for an early release Xbox 360 title, it looks so good. In preparation for this review, I pumped a few Xbox exclusive games through the FrameMeister, and in my opinion, Conker Live and Reloaded is easily the best looking Xbox game I happen to own. The fact that Conker Live and Reloaded can even maintain a consistent 30 frames per second is more than I can say about Fable or Halo 2 or the N64 original for that matter. It's amazing how much of a difference an extra 5 FPS could make in the overall smoothness of the visuals and game feel. The new character models look pretty good on the whole, and the addition of real-time fur rendering is a nice touch. The environments have also seen a nice improvement, with some of the nicest water I've seen in a 6th generation video game. Similar to the N64 original, Conker Live and Reloaded has some of the best texture work on the system, and Pooh Mountain has simply never looked more majestic. Compare these to the environments in Halo 2 and the blurry textures in most PlayStation 2 games, and Live and Reloaded clearly wins hands down. All these elements together go a long way in selling the updated art style, which kind of reminds me of the Crash Insane trilogy. It strikes a fine balance between realistic and cartoony, taking advantage of the more advanced hardware while still preserving the overall aesthetic of the original. That said, there are a few noticeable differences I should discuss. Many of the character designs have seen some changes, some major, others minor. Conker, for example, has ditched his gloves and put on a pair of trousers. For the most part, I think the altered character designs are quite well done and go a long way in selling the characters as they were originally written. The bouncer Rock Monster and Rock Solid, for example, now now actually looks pretty menacing, which makes more sense than his old dumpy design. The only change I noticed that seemed pretty pointless is that asshole cog has been changed from gray to gold. Not sure why, but that doesn't really offend me. Also on the topic of tweaked art direction, the spooky chapter has undergone a complete design overhaul. Not only does Conker don a Van Helsing outfit, which is fitting, but the grungy river is replaced with a giant pool of blood, and the grotto has become a quiet village. Personally, I like the new direction a lot better. It just makes more sense in the context of the chapter. Conker also dons full army regulation attire for It's War. Now, that said, there are a few niggles I have with the graphics. For one thing, was it really so much to ask for fully articulated eyes? With the exception of Booga the Nut, the Panther King, and Conker himself, every character in this game has eyes that are textured onto their heads rather than dedicated eyeball geometry. It's really noticeable how every character seems to stare straight ahead and never move their eyes. The original game did this too, but it was an N64 game, not a late release Xbox title. In fact, the remake actually removes a bit of eye articulation from the abuse of Cog, who otherwise has better facial animations here. Also worth mentioning is the cow model. Oh my god, what's wrong with your face? The body looks pretty good and has real-time fur and everything, but the face just looks unfinished and it's really distracting. Third, the blood effect in the Don Weezo scene looks worse than the original. And while I'm at it, the snot effect in that one scene doesn't look as good either. It only lasts a few seconds, but it's noticeable nonetheless. Fourth, the lighting can sometimes flake out, even on the main menu, though that could be my console. Most egregious though is the use of pre-rendered textures to disguise the passages between game environments. This is mostly done in the front half of the game, and maybe it looks more convincing on a CRT, but I honestly think the plain black in the original looked a lot better. For the most part, however, when you're just playing the game like normal, none of the stuff is really all that noticeable, which is why I still think the graphics in the remake look better than the originals on the whole. Moving on to the presentation, it also has a few problems. One positive is that for the most part the voice acting uses the same recordings from the original game, only before they got hyper compressed to fit on a 64 megabyte cartridge. So what you get is the same voice acting you loved in the original, except not in potato quality, which gets a thumbs up from me.
Not from around here, are you, boy? No, I'm from the 21st century.
Not from around here, are you, boy?
No, I'm from the 21st century.
There are a handful of new lines included, such as this new scene with the gargoyle in the Hungover chapter where you can tell Chris Seaver forgot how to do the voice.
If you think you're coming this way, you can think again. A frying pan. You stupid little...
But that constitutes maybe 1% of the dialogue. I do have one other thing to mention in this regard, but I'm gonna save that for later. Trust me, I'm not forgetting it. The animations tend to rank up at the top complaints about the remake, and I'm kind of wishy-washy on them myself. For the most part, it's 1-to-1 with the N64 version, warts and all. Almost like they just carried over the same motion capture data from the original. There are a couple moments where it looks a bit better, like the lip sync on the abusive cog, and a couple moments where they just change it to something a little bit different, but there are very few moments where the animations look noticeably worse than the original. That said, seeing as this is a 6th gen remake, I feel like there's reason to expect a little better here. I mean, compare this game to Jack or Ratchet and it's no contest. The animations in those games are way better. So really, I'd just say the animations are middle of the road. They're not the best ever, but they get the job done. When it comes to the soundtrack, however, the remake's got the original beat pretty handily in my opinion. I like the original tracks a lot, but Live and Reloaded remixes them with real instruments and it's A+ stuff. All the swing tracks from the original game, like Windy, really benefit from the authentic big band instrumentation. And all the area-specific remixes sound loads better too. Barn Boys uses real banjos and harmonicas and it's fan-freaking-tastic. All the genre-specific tracks also get a nice boost from the real instruments. Surf Punk sounds absolutely incredible with real instruments, and it has the N64 track beat by a country mile. Beyond the addition of real instruments, Live and Reloaded also makes a few tweaks to existing tracks to make them that much better. Mad Pitchfork in the original game was just a forgettable little banjo riff, which got the job done. Mad Pitchfork in the remake, on the other hand, introduces a bit of a swing vibe, turning it into one of my favorite tracks in the game. Rock Solid was already a great track in the original, but the remake extends it by an additional 5 minutes so you can get even more turned up. Undead gets completely changed altogether, going from a forgettable bit of ambience to an actual song that happens to have the same creepy noises in it. Music is always pretty subjective, but the remade soundtrack nevertheless gets a thumbs up from me. So, with all that said, let's move on to the gameplay at last. Let's get this out of the way right now. The late 90s and early 2000s were the golden, or perhaps dark age of genre-busting and mascot platforming games. Crash, Sonic, Spyro, Sly Cooper, you name it. Gameplay styles up the wazoo. I have no problem with genre-busting in itself, because it really depends on how well executed the gameplay styles are in their own and how well they mesh together to form a cohesive whole. For the most part, I feel like the titles I mentioned do a good job of fleshing out core gameplay and focusing the variety in constructive ways. I'm not so sure I can say the same about Conker's Bad Fur Day. While I made a point of covering all the playstyles in depth in my Sonic Dreamcast reviews, and while I'll probably be doing the same whenever I happen to cover the rest of the Sly games, I really don't feel like there's a point in doing so here. I can get my points across thoroughly enough by sticking to general impressions and noteworthy mentions. Now, Conker's Bad Fur Day is supposedly a free-roaming 3D platforming game, and if you've ever played one of those, the base controls should feel comfortable and familiar to you. Though supposedly the core of the gameplay, Conker has surprisingly little platforming in it. Most of the really involved sections are in the first half, and after that it becomes really understated. The platforming in the Banjo-Kazooie games is about on the same level, but that game backed it up with other consistent threads such as the completionist aspect, the speedrunning potential, the exploration factor, and the ubiquity of Banjo and Kazooie's moveset. Conker, unfortunately, lacks any analogous focused threads because it's always jumping from one gameplay gimmick to another. That, and it's got a few problems that further hamper the core platforming. For some reason, Conker can't jump down from even the slightest of heights without incurring touch damage. I'm aware that fall damage is pretty common in many 3D platforming games, but Conker's fall damage is by far the most sensitive I've ever experienced. The problem is that Conker loves making you climb vertical platforming sections with no easy way to get back down. While the sections themselves can be a lot of fun to scale, you're then forced to choose between slowly climbing back down the way you came, or jumping straight down and hoping you tank the hit. Needless to say, that's annoying, and it makes a lot of the platforming more of a pain than it really needs to be. The second problem is the camera. Like Banjo-Tooie, it offers full camera rotation rather than that snapping angle nonsense from Super Mario 64. For wide open areas, it works pretty well, but the preset angles can be problematic. In Klang's Lair, for example, you have to hide from these robotic sharks in these little alcoves, but because of how the camera is oriented, you'll never know when the coast is clear because you can't see the sharks. There are other occasional camera snafus sprinkled throughout the game, and while it never amounts to much more than a slight nuisance, it's still a way the game has aged. I know I'm getting kind of negative right out of the gate, but that's because there's so little overtly positive for me to talk about gameplay-wise. While none of this gameplay is horrible or anything, most of it boils down to a bunch of dull, of plodding, repetitive fetch quests that just amount to mindless busywork. You know those lady Piantas in Mario Sunshine that ask you to bring them 3 pieces of the same fruit for a blue coin? Imagine if that was the entire game. One of the first sections in the game involves grabbing these cheese guys and feeding them to this mouse. You have to bring him 3 of these, and the mouse and the cheese are always in the same place every time, and it's not even all that challenging to dodge these hopping boxes. And that's pretty much what the majority of the game amounts to. Grab the thing and bring it to the other thing. There are also a couple of escort missions which are equally as slow and boring, like slowly walking this dinosaur across this walkway as he stops to eat a caveman every 5 seconds. A lot of the other sections are more interesting mechanically, but similarly boil down to a boring, repetitive slog. Take the section with the bowl, for example. You let the cow out, climb on the bowl, hit the cow, let her drink, then hit the cow again. Rinse and repeat, except you have to add an additional hit for each new cow. Riveting gameplay, huh? How about the Colosseum section, where you ride a carnivorous raptor? I'm not sure how they managed to take something so awesome and make it dull, but they succeeded. The bosses are all kind of the same deal. Most of them are like the bourgeois big bollock boiler. Lead him into the pad, dump the crap on him, hit him in the balls, rinse and repeat. He doesn't change up his strategy meaningfully, he doesn't get faster or more aggressive, you just do the same thing over and over until the boss ends. Other bosses at least try to add extra hits or new attacks, but it's not nearly enough to make them challenging or all that interesting. Mediocre bosses are hardly the most offensive thing a game can do, but when the core gameplay is already so repetitive and drawn out, the lack of fun boss battles doesn't really do Conker any favors. Of course, there are sections in Conker's Bad Fur Day that do amount to more than mindless repetitive busywork, and which do involve some element of challenge to make them interesting. Only problem is that they're over almost as soon as they begin, and oftentimes they can get pretty frustrating too. The pissing sections are probably the best example. You only make use of this for 2 sections out of the entire game, with the first section being really easy and the other one being really annoying. Oftentimes it feels like your piss doesn't go far enough to push them in, unless you keep tapping the button over and over so that it goes a little farther. On a related note, the early game tutorializes things pretty well, but the moment the game moves on to the more complex stuff, like the pissing mechanic for example, the tutorials suddenly disappear. Yes, I tried pressing L and B, but nothing happened. There's also a racing section in the game, because goodness knows no 3D platformer of the time could resist that craze. On paper, it's good gameplay. You've got simple to learn controls and a straightforward challenge. Problem is, they decided to stick these dinosaurs in the middle of the course, and their positioning is completely erratic. You have to go at full speed to catch up with the cavemen, but when you do that, the dinosaur will often move into a position you can't easily dodge. Hit him anywhere and you die instantly. I recalled this section being pretty annoying, and I did die a few times, but it's not nearly as bad as I remembered. Still nothing super fun though. The moment you reach the 2/3 mark, however, Conker's Bad Fur Day just becomes a third-person shooter. The game tries to ease you into it with the slingshot and the knife throwing, neither of which have reticles for some reason, but that's still not going to prepare you for when you have to start strafing. Let's get this out of the way right now. The shooting controls have not aged very well. Everyone knows about the dual analog scheme that debuted in the 6th generation. You move and strafe with the left stick and aim with the right. It's become the de facto way to play mainstream shooting games because it's simple and very intuitive. It wouldn't debut in a mainstream title until 2002, 2003, and the N64 controller only has the one analog stick, so obviously expecting dual analog is unreasonable. They had to work with the controller they had. So what you get is tank movement on the analog stick with strafing on the C buttons, which acts as a D-pad. In order to actually aim, you have to hold down the R button, and at that point it basically becomes like dual analog except the sticks are swapped. On an actual N64 controller, the unique form factor helps me overcome my muscle memory and kind of make it work. Frankly, I'm not one to shy away from unconventional shooting controls when the game walks you through it and it's executed well. Games like Mega Man Legends also have unconventional pre-dual analog controls, but the difference is that they don't start you out with the hard stuff right away. They teach you how the controls work from the beginning and gradually ease you into the big stuff. They also tend to have lock-on or aim assist features and generally don't ask you to make a lot of precision shots. These things together help the player to learn the mechanics and not overstep the limitations of the control scheme. Frankly, Conker just lacks this nuanced design. There's no tutorial for the controls whatsoever, which is already pretty bad. And the first shooting section in the game expects you to make a bunch of precision headshots with pinpoint accuracy right off the bat. Pun entirely intended. The good news is that you can cheese the zombies in Spooky by standing on the tombstones and aiming down at them, or by just running past them in the manor. By the time you reach its war though, the game goes full-on shooter. I absolutely hated this chapter the first time I played it, and while I enjoy it increasingly more with every playthrough, it's still my absolute least favorite part of the game by far. This whole joke of playing the brutality of war totally straight except with cute woodland creatures isn't all that funny, the graphics are unpleasant to look at, and the gameplay is 90% shooting with dated, awkward controls. The first sections also keep alternating between platforming around these lasers and shooting the teddies, so you're constantly swapping between two totally different control schemes just to progress. That's the last thing I need when I'm still having trouble just trying to aim. This chapter just drags on and on, thanks to the awful pacing and a bunch of difficulty spikes. I must have died 10 times in this machine gun section just trying to figure out what I was supposed to be doing. And this escape sequence on the beach can eat a fucking dick. You have to take cover behind these Czech hedgehogs to avoid the bazooka fire from these teddies, but while you're hiding there, the hedgehogs block your fire too. And in the time it takes for you to strafe out from behind and aim at the bears with the awkward controls, they'll more than likely shoot first and kill you instantly. It's a massive difficulty spike that comes completely out of nowhere and almost made me rage quit. That pretty much sums up Conker's solo gameplay in a nutshell. It has a few genuinely enjoyable moments and a few fun or cathartic set pieces here and there, but for the most part it's either dull and repetitive, frustrating, or just not that interesting. This game could have really benefited from either doubling down on the platforming elements or doubling down on the shooter gameplay. Either one would have been fine by me, but as is, it just comes off as an unfocused mess that never reaches its fullest potential on anything. Variety is nice when all the components are interesting and done in service of the core gameplay, but Conker doesn't do that. It is the prototypical early 2000s kitchen sink platformer. So you're probably wondering how Live and Reloaded compares when it comes to gameplay. Well, there are actually way more differences than I could have ever imagined, but let's stick with the big stuff for now. Live and Reloaded carries over every chapter and subsection from the original game, from Hungover to Heist. So that means that many of the complaints I had about the original carry over to the remake. All the fetch quests, escort missions, repetitive minigames, and boss battles from the original game have carried over here. That said, many of these sections have seen some changes. For example, the fetch quest in Pooh Mountain in the original version saw you dragging 6 pieces of sweet corn to the shithole in the center. The remake cuts this down to just 3. The bowl section in Sloprano has also limited the number of hits on each cow to get them to drink the prune juice to just 1. In Rock Solid, the remake introduces strafing to the pissing controls, makes the pathway upstairs much more obvious, adds another ramp so you don't have to slog all the way around just to get sober again, and only requires you to roll 1 boulder into the secondary holes to free Barry from the cage. It also adds a bit of platforming at the end. Also, I might be imagining things, but I swear the dinosaur in Mugged has a much more forgiving hitbox this time around. I actually beat this section on my first try. Other sections have simply been made easier. The wasps seem to give you a wider berth in the remake, whereas in the original they get right up on your ass. The jumping boxes and barn boys were made smaller, making that section that slightest bit more pointless. Bouncing on the sunflower's boobs, which was surprisingly complex in the original for some reason, has been made a lot simpler here. Also, the electric eel section in Its War was removed in favor of a simple switch, which defeats the purpose of having the switch to begin with. In other cases, the locations for some fetch quest items were changed. This set of tickly bees was moved from up here to down here, and one of the lady cogs was moved from in here to over there. Personally, I don't really mind most of these changes. I mean, you probably could have kept the electric eel section and the second hit in Rock Solid, but most of these sections were either really annoying, boring, or repetitive in the original, so anything that allows me to push through them quicker and get to the good stuff is alright by me. By far the biggest difference in Live and Reloaded is the controls, which have seen a total overhaul across the board. Honestly, the Duke is surprisingly comfortable for how bulky it is, and the remake takes full advantage of the dual analog for vastly superior controls. First of all, the sensitivity of both sticks are leaps and bounds ahead of the N64's stubby nub, making making for overall more precise movement. Second, the inclusion of analog camera control is a substantial improvement over the original. All the problematic preset angles from the original are gone, allowing you to turn the camera to the most convenient angle at all times. Third, the combat has been updated. Trying to hit all these MacGuffins with the frying pan was kind of annoying in the original because of how you stopped in place for so long when you were trying to swing at running targets. The remake replaces the frying pan with a baseball bat that you can swing in a sort of lock strafe mode, which makes it much easier to hit things. A side effect is that the remake adds a bunch of mooks to kill throughout the game, which was something that was noticeably absent in the original. After all, what's the point of giving the character a weapon if there aren't any enemies until the shooting sections? At first, I found this kind of annoying because of how awkward it felt, until I realized that there was a 3-hit combo you could do by pulling the trigger in a particular rhythm. This combo easily clocks all the zombies and clang goblins. While it adds a little seasoning to the existing levels, the combat itself doesn't progress beyond bashing the same enemies apart with the same uppercut combo. So there was some wasted potential here. Honestly, beyond the lack of variety though, it's really not much worse than the combat in Banjo or Ukulele. Still, I think the improvement to the control makes it worth it. The swimming and flying controls, which are essentially identical, have been completely changed in the remake to take advantage of the dual analog. The original's controlled just fine, but it's definitely easier to see where you're going and move about than it was in the original. The remake also vastly extends Conker's breath meter for swimming sections, which were pretty goddamn tight in the original. By far the greatest improvement to the controls, and I bet you all saw this coming, is the shooting controls. I cannot even begin to describe how much of an improvement this is. If you've ever played a mainstream shooter over the past 10 years, you should have absolutely no problem here. The strafing is on the left stick, aiming is on the right, and because of the better analog sensitivity, aiming and shooting at things is a snap. Plus, because it makes use of the same lock strafe scheme as the baseball bat, the remake does a much better job easing you into it, lack of a tutorial aside. Even the sections where you shoot in place are a lot more fun thanks to the simple addition of an aiming reticle. Seriously, trying to hit these wires is so much more straightforward now. And really, the better controls make all the difference in the world when it comes to Spooky and its war. The remake actually adds a lot more enemies for you to shoot at, but because the controls actually worked with me, I found myself wanting to shoot the zombies because I was enjoying it this time. That shitty section where you have to dodge the Teddy's turret has been removed altogether, and the beach escape now allows you to shoot at the instant kill bazooka Teddies with your regular machine gun instead of the slow bazooka, paving over the biggest difficulty spikes from the original. Between the improved controls and the other changes, I actually had a lot of fun with its war in the remake, which is something I never thought I'd say. Beyond that stuff is an assortment of other random gameplay changes. There's quite a few of these, so please don't kill me if I forget to mention something or fail to pick up on a more trivial change. Live and Reloaded introduces loading screens, but they're infrequent and last maybe 5 to 10 seconds, so I can get over that. Anti-gravity chocolate pieces respawn faster, the game will save your lives counter for whenever you reboot the console for another session, and the pause menu now reveals how many cash wads you found in an area. Its war adds a new mini-boss in the hospital section. There are a bunch of other minor changes here and there that generally amount to added convenience, which is alright by me. The last change that I should mention, that I probably should have addressed earlier when I talked about the presentation, is what seems to be the single greatest complaint people have about Live and Reloaded, and it really amounts to the most harmless thing in the world. Certain swear words that were uncensored in the original are now censored in the remake. Yes, there are seriously people who will dismiss Live and Reloaded as a bad remake just because of that. Maybe there are other reasons that go along with it, but that's the only one I ever really hear. Frankly, this whole censorship thing tends to overshadow Live and Reloaded itself. There isn't a single person I've asked about this remake who hasn't brought it up in some capacity. So what are the facts here? Well, the original game left the words shit, twat, bastard, ass, bitch, asshole, and fellatio uncensored, with fuck being censored. Live and Reloaded censors the words fuck, shit, twat, asshole, and fellatio, but leaves bitch, ass, and bastard uncensored. This whole thing doesn't really make much sense. Like, why is asshole so much worse than ass as to warrant censorship? Is fellatio really too hot for TV? I'm not really sure whose idea this was, seeing as the Xbox was marketed as a console for mature gamers. I can agree that this whole thing doesn't make sense and wasn't necessary. That said, do I think the added censorship is a major knock against the game that single-handedly ruins the magic of the original and turns this remake into an inferior product? Nope. Not even close. In fact, it might just be the most overblown criticism against a remake I've ever heard. I would be more understanding if Rare had removed controversial cutscenes from the game or something, but if anything, they were just made gorier, cruder, and more intense in some instances compared to the original. Here's the thing, folks, and I'm just gonna come out and say it. Curse words on their own are not funny. Maybe they are when you're 8 years old and your parents spank you for saying them, but in today's curse-saturated entertainment marketplace, curse words aren't all that shocking or funny on their own anymore. I'm not an expert on comedy by any means, and in fact, I'd say my tastes are pretty pedestrian, but I know enough to say that comedy is all about context and surprising the audience. Curse words are just another tool to set up and pay off on a comedic premise. Conker as a whole is banking on one larger joke. The fact that characters you're used to seeing in kiddie platformers are now smoking, drinking booze, defecating in public, violently exploding in a bloody mess, and saying curse words. It violates your expectations and makes you laugh. At that point, whether the curse words are censored or not essentially becomes a matter of semantics, since you still understand the larger joke the game is trying to tell. Cartoon characters and kiddie platformers don't normally swear at you. Case in point, the word fuck is censored in the N64 version, and last I checked, all these cutscenes are still funny.
Get your ass in there. There's these cows. Get them in there. Get them to crap. And I'll make it a ball of poo. And you can do what the hell you like with it. Go on your break. You still here? That.
Oh, charming.
Context, context, context. That said, I can hardly agree that bleeping out a couple curse words ruins the magic of the original when A, the censoring is so poor that the words stay obvious, B, the larger joke still connects, and C, the original censored some words to begin with. In some instances, I'd argue that the added beeps just make it funnier. They call extra attention to the fact that characters like these wouldn't normally say these things, which pushes the joke further.
It's alright, it's alright. That's not a squirrel. He's an elephant. An elephant. You stupid twat. An elephant. You stupid twat.
Again, maybe the curse words were funny on their own back in 2001, but in an era where even the AVGN's once hilariously explosive rants now seem quaint, I don't think it's all that impressive anymore. Even if I agree that this was a big problem, I'd still implore us all to weight it against everything the remake does right. Think about all the stuff I've told you over the past 40 odd minutes, all the tiny and major improvements that address hiccups in the original, and stack them against the censorship thing. If these two games were entirely the same except for this one thing, then yeah, I would call it the inferior version too. But I really think you ought to judge this remake more holistically, and not get bogged down in what amounts to maybe 30 total seconds of cutscene content out of the game's running time. Bottom line, while I can agree that the added beeps weren't necessary, I can't agree that they single-handedly turned Live and Reloaded into an inferior product. The only other thing worth mentioning is obviously the multiplayer. This is probably the biggest difference between the two versions, which offer their own exclusive multiplayer content. The N64 version has a grab bag of modes: Heist, Total War, Colors, Race, etc. Many involve the shooting gameplay from Spooky and It's War, and use the same shooting controls, so good luck finding someone who knows how they work. Another mode is a straightforward hoverboard race based on the mugged section in Ooga Booga. The multiplayer in the remake, as far as I can tell, is very similar to most shooters of the time. You've got a whole bunch of classes you can choose from, each with their own weapons, a variety of maps, and a few modes. Conker Live and Reloaded was supposedly one of the top 10 most popular games on Xbox Live before Microsoft pulled the plug on the OG Xbox in 2010, and you can still play it online with people in the post-Xbox Live era using X-Link Kai. Surprisingly, there's also a multiplayer prequel/sequel to Conker's Bad Fur Day called Chapter X, but the story story elements are just there, and I couldn't even beat the first mission because of the strict time limit and how much punishment these explosive barrels take before they explode. That's really all I have to say. I've never played a match of online multiplayer in my life, and I wouldn't know the first thing about reviewing it. As for the N64 modes, it's all just there, and it's nothing too special. I hope I haven't disappointed you guys too much, but I'll be judging Bad Fur Day and Live and Reloaded primarily as a single player experience. All that said, you're probably wondering what the Rare Replay port of the N64 version plays like. Are there any improvements or enhancements that help it catch up with the Xbox version? Well, not really. Rather than building a new game engine and improving the aspect ratio or frame rate like the Xbox 360 ports of the Banjo games, Conker's Bad Fur Day on Rare Replay is simply an emulation of the original N64 ROM. In fact, you'll get a nigh identical experience by playing the game in Project 64 in 960p. The only real change is that they slightly altered some graphics to remove the Nintendo references. One thing I should mention is that the graphics are up-resed rather than upscaled. So while you get finer looking character models and nice looking textures, you also get blocky looking 2D elements. Up-resing and upscaling both have their pros and cons, and it really boils down to preference which is better. Beyond all that, Conker on Rare Replay is the exact same thing as the original, all the way down to the dated shooting controls. Unlike Jet Force Gemini on Rare Replay, which was patched to offer the option for a more modern control scheme, Conker offers no such option whatsoever. The controls are mapped to their equivalent spots in the Xbox One controller, and I actually think it's even worse than before. At least when I'm holding an N64 controller, the lack of the second stick and the presence of the C-pad makes it much easier to reprogram my muscle memory. With the Xbox form factor, where dual analog has always been a mainstay, it's far more difficult to wrap my head around the fact that the sticks have essentially been swapped and the aiming inverted, making its war even more of a pain in the ass than it was before. So overall, I'd say that if you own an Xbox One, Rare Replay is a suitable option if you want to play the original Conker's Bad Fur Day on console, especially since you get a whole bunch of other games in the same package. Not all of them are great, mind you, but it's well worth the low price of admission. That said, I really wish they had bothered to update the game to appease modern gaming sensibilities, especially when Project 64 offers essentially the same experience for free. The lack of an option to play the shooting sections with modern controls on a modern controller was a particularly serious oversight, especially when Jet Force Gemini was fortunate enough to get that despite also being a straight emulation. So that brings us to our conclusion. How well does Conker Live and Reloaded stack up with Conker's Bad Fur Day on Nintendo 64? Well, let's go out of order for a change and start with what I thought of the game itself. The first time I played Conker's Bad Fur Day, it blew me away. I loved it so much that I was prepared to call it one of my favorite games of all time. But with every passing playthrough, especially with the 3 full playthroughs I did for this episode, my impressions of the game just weakened. That's not to say there aren't a lot of positives to mention. The graphics are A+ for N64, the soundtrack is catchy and varied, and if you're into the humor, the story is a lot of fun on your first playthrough. Unfortunately, Conker doesn't get much more than a passing grade when it comes to the most important thing of all, the gameplay. For a game that seems to bill itself as a 3D platforming game, there's surprisingly little platforming past the beginning. Most of the game is spent completing pointless fetch quests and plotting escort missions. Most bosses are dull and repetitive, and the shooting gameplay is difficult to go back to and dominates the last third of the game. The remainder of the gameplay, which ranges from pissing on things to hoverboard racing to riding a bull to flying around as a bat, is either not that interesting or really frustrating. The problem is that the game is so busy jumping from one thing to another that it never fleshes out any of its ideas beyond their basis level. Because of that, the game never really gets any better than average. While very little of it stoops so low to become terrible, none of it ever stands so tall as to become great either. Frankly, if it wasn't for the story, I really don't think this game would have developed the cult following it enjoys today. The thing is, on a first playthrough, you're not really thinking too hard about the gameplay because you're focused on the comedy and the character interactions, and you're pretty much just going along for the ride. The problem with relying so heavily on shock humor, however, is that it can only really shock you the first time. So in subsequent playthroughs, you already have the game's number, and after a while while, the cutscenes become boring to sit through because of how slow, numerous, and unskippable they are when you start a new save. It's the original Dreamcast version of Sonic Adventure 1 all over again. While this is essentially true for any story-focused game, the problem here is that Conker doesn't have the gameplay it needs to back up the story. The best video games, in my opinion, are the ones you can come back to any day, anytime. These are the games that are endlessly replayable because of how well the elements synergize together, and how straightforward and engaging they are to revisit. The problem is that Conker's Bad Fur Day blows its load in the first playthrough, and after that you're just left with sloppy seconds. With more interesting, focused, and developed gameplay, and the ability to skip cutscenes regardless of whether you've seen them before, I might feel more of an incentive to revisit it despite the deteriorating story. As is, it's only worth revisiting when you've forgotten enough of the story to make it feel somewhat fresh again. Really, just about everything I said about the original version carries over to Live and Reloaded as well. That said, I still think this is the vastly preferable way to play Conker's Bad Fur Day. Remake. As always, I define a re-release with a remake score as one which smooths over the flaws of the original and adds new content. Conker Live and Reloaded does just that. The graphics, subject to the few visual quirks I mentioned, are a monumental improvement over the original game and some of the best I've witnessed on the original Xbox. The music sounds even better than ever thanks to the addition of real instruments and reimagined elements for other tracks. The quality of the original cutscene recordings has dramatically increased thanks to the bigger storage medium. By far the greatest improvement, however, is the control, which single-handedly elevates the entire experience. Conker has simply never handled better, all thanks to the Xbox's dual analog. While I still don't think the gameplay is all that great, I can at least credit Live and Reloaded with trimming down or speeding up some of the fetch quests and boring stuff, while also removing the frustrating elements from the It's War chapter. While this does result in Live and Reloaded being an overall easier game than the original, I don't really mind that, seeing as the original's idea of difficulty often amounted to add an extra hit point to each round of the thing. Thus, this remake improves the visuals, sound, and controls while also attenuating the mediocrity of the original gameplay. It also throws in a completely revamped multiplayer mode for good measure, and while it's not something I'll get much out of, I can see why it was so popular in the Xbox's twilight years. Because of that, and in spite of some criticisms I do have, it is my opinion that Conker Live and Reloaded is the definitive way to play Conker's Bad Fur Day. Not to mention a vastly cheaper way. Not only will you save a good $50 compared to an N64 cart, but it's fully compatible with your Xbox 360 and will look great on your new TV. That said, I'm not prepared to bump this game up to a replay score for several reasons. For one, because the multiplayer is different between the two versions, there's still a reason, however small, to go back to the original. Beyond that, however, I feel that despite all the improvements, the remake doesn't quite reach its true potential. The animations, though mostly one-to-one with the original game with some improvements and neutral differences, are inferior to those found in other mainstream platforming games at the time. The lack of moving eyeballs is really distracting, and a few other visual details just don't look that great. I also think there were some missed opportunities for new additions, like a new chapter, seeing as the game isn't even all that long to begin with. And sure, while I think it's an overblown criticism, the added bleeps on certain curse words wasn't necessary and is a minor ding against the presentation. All in all, it kind of reminds me of the Klonoa remake on the Wii. That was another case where I felt the remake eked out a victory over the original, but failed to capitalize on all the opportunities available to it. It's also another case where proponents of the original seem to hate it for things I perceive as very minor. While I still would call it the definitive version, I still don't think Live and Reloaded is quite improved enough to earn a replay score. Now, as always, you're welcome to prefer whatever version for whichever reasons that make sense to you, but this was my review, and that was my opinion.
Well, that's another giant video done and over with. This ended up being a much more difficult video to produce than I originally anticipated, so hopefully you guys enjoyed it. But the good news is that the ROR train doesn't stop here. Join me next time when we kick off the mediocre marathon with Pac-Man World on the PlayStation and Pac-Man World on the Game Boy Advance. Yes, this is a remake. Until then, I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and I hope you all enjoyed the review.
Hello, Exo here. If this was the first video you watched from yours truly and you're not too mad at me for preferring the Xbox remake, then consider hitting that subscribe button and perhaps leaving a like. I have several other projects on YouTube that you can all check out. First up is the Unversed Cast, which is a podcast collab channel I do with Haydox, Ryrol, and King K. We read snippets from bad fanfiction, we talk about gaming news, we offer impressions, and sometimes we actually answer questions from you guys, the viewers. Second is a brand new channel I've just launched and will be working on in the coming days, EPG Plays. This will be the one-stop destination for solo Let's Plays and live streams from now on. So if you're looking forward to a Metroid Prime 3 playthrough or a 101% live stream of Donkey Kong 64, then that's the place to subscribe to. This was also my first review since I enabled monetization, so let me know what you thought of those mid-rolls. I'm still getting my bearings on this thing. That's all for now, and take care.